Greetings, friends. I am Vitaly Portnikov. The relationship between Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the President of the United States, Donald Trump, has deteriorated to such an extent that during a meeting of the Parliamentary Committee on Foreign Affairs and Security, the head of the Israeli government even spoke about a possible fatigue with American military aid, which could soon set in, just as at one time there was fatigue with economic assistance. Just a few months ago, it would have been hard to imagine that the Prime Minister of Israel would make such assumptions in front of parliamentarians. But aside from this statement, there are also a number of obvious political facts that indicate a deterioration in relations between Trump and the head of the Israeli government. His inner circle does not hide its negative attitude toward Netanyahu. Trump's special representative in the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, who incidentally has been handling virtually all of the key foreign policy areas for the American president in recent months, stated on one of the Israeli TV channels that the United States wants to secure the release of hostages and an end to the conflict, while Israel does not want to end the war. Although in Washington, they do not understand what further progress can be made. At the same time, it has become known that there are direct negotiations taking place between the leadership of the terrorist organization Hamas and the administration of the President of the United States. Trump himself is planning to visit the Middle East, but Israel is not included in his tour. However, during his stay in Saudi Arabia, the President of the United States will meet not only with the leaders of that country, but also with the head of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, and the new president of Syria, al-Shara. At the same time, it is important to take into account Jerusalem's negative attitude toward both of these politicians. Abbas is constantly accused by the Israeli government of effectively boycotting any possibility of reconciliation between Israelis and Palestinians, while al-Shara is regarded as a terrorist and a supporter of radical Islamism who only pretends to be a secular leader in order to gain power in Syria. Trump, by the way, will be meeting with the new president of Syria after Israel carried out a series of strikes on Syrian territory, justifying its actions as protecting Syria's national and religious minorities from the new government. At the same time, it should be recalled that during his stay in Washington, Benjamin Netanyahu, one could say, behaved exemplarily. At that time, observers compared his behavior in the Oval Office to that of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and claimed that in order to achieve the desired outcome, one should act exactly as Netanyahu did and not at all as Zelensky did. But after the scandal with Zelensky, Trump tried to smooth over the situation, resumed military aid to Ukraine, and agreed to sign a declarative agreement on U.S. investment policy in that country, which is known as the so-called Minerals Agreement. In the case of Israel, however, what followed was rather a serious cooling of relations. Moreover, the first signs of this cooling could already be seen in the Oval Office when President Trump, aware of his Israeli guest's cold attitude toward Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, as well as Erdogan's pro-Hamas stance, which he adopted as his main position after October 7, 2023, spoke about his own warm relationship with the Turkish president, expressed admiration for him, and promised Netanyahu to help resolve the conflict with Turkey, while also advising the Israeli Prime Minister to act with prudence. Even this exchange of views on Turkey could demonstrate that a serious cooling had occurred between the two former friends, and that a situation was looming which could lead to a further escalation of the crisis in relation between Washington and Jerusalem. At the same time, in the private statements, representatives of the Trump administration do not mince words at all and claim that Benjamin Netanyahu and his ministers are deceiving the American administration. In turn, representatives of the Israeli government, again in private, expressed their protest to members of the US President's administration regarding the actions of Trump and his circle in the Middle East. The conflict is obvious, and it is unlikely to be resolved in the near future. It is worth recalling, however, that just a few months ago, most Israelis regarded Trump as the best president for the Jewish state. They remembered that it was he who recognized Jerusalem as the united and indivisible capital of Israel, moved the American embassy to that city, achieved the Abraham Accords that normalized relations between Israel and a number of Arab countries, and at the time were mistakenly considered a platform for ensuring the security of the Jewish state. However, it turned out that this perception held by most Israelis about Trump's focus on Israel's security was nothing more than a utopia. Trump, and this is what most citizens of the Jewish state fail to understand, is not focused on Israel's security, but on his own interests. And if there are currently no people in his inner circle who defend Israel's interests the way there were during his first presidency, it is not because he doesn't trust these people, who, by the way, are members of his own family, but because at that time his interests coincided with theirs and with Israel's interests. And since the President of the United States now has different interests, such as investments from Saudi Arabia in the American economy, he no longer needs either Israel's interests or relatives who could effectively help the Jewish state ensure its security. A very simple and very cynical logic, which of course should benefit the supporters of the current American president, but most likely will not. That is why even now, during Trump's trip to the Middle East, Israel would do well to prepare for new stunning surprises. Well, to the kind of surprises that have already occurred after the United States reached an agreement with the Houthis in Yemen that they would stop shelling American ships, and on that basis ended the military operation against the terrorist group Ansar Allah. When asked directly whether Trump cares more about the interests of Israel, which is still being attacked by the Yemeni Houthis, the American president stated absolutely clearly and unequivocally that he does not care. In fact, he has never cared. And this is precisely the fact that defines Donald Trump's political strategy. Tactically, he might care in situations where the interests of a particular country align with his own interests. Among these countries could be Israel, Ukraine, and even the United States itself. But strategically, if Donald Trump's interests end up conflicting with the interests of a country that recently admired his support, that country should prepare for turbulence and fasten its seatbelt. Thank you, friends. Stay tuned to this channel and subscribe to it. Subscribe to my social media, to the channels on Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, and Donatella, which help support these resources, and use the sponsorship feature right here on YouTube. Peace to you all.